Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the third installation of our We the People Roundtable series. Our first two conversations were very timely. The first one was on the politics of the rule of law, and the second one was on queer equality and whether the Constitution has delivered on its promise of dignity for all. These conversations, brought to you by the Nelson Mandela Foundation and the Constitution Hill Trust, are in commemoration of the 25th anniversary of our Constitution. It is a platform which allows us to take stock of where our constitutional democracy stands in its 25th year. Tonight's discussion, titled Electoral Reform, Can We Build a Better Democracy?, I think is quite urgent considering the events of the past month. And actually this week I saw a headline on the New York Times. I don't know if any of the panelists saw it. The headline was, South Africa is falling apart. It was a depressing headline, but at the same time, I saw opportunity in the falling apart. I think part of constitutional experimentation is something that people call creative destruction. The fact that we can reassess, reinvent, and reevaluate where we stand and the systems that we decided on so many years ago. So I'm hoping tonight's panelists will be able to take us through electoral reform in light of events of the past month. And just to say, I represent the Constitution Hill Trust, which was established to promote constitutionalism and to build trust in our constitutional democracy. Our latest project, which actually lives up to this objective, can be found on our constitution.constitutionhill.org.za. It's an online exhibition that actually tells the story of South Africa's journey from colonialism, apartheid, to our constitutional democracy today. And as our constitutional democracy matures, and as we keep adding chapters to the story, we think it's imperative for South Africans to share the experiences of our constitutional democracy, the good and the bad. So if you are interested in listening to our previous discussions, the first two roundtables, you can visit our constitution.constitutionhill.org.za. And if you want to share your story, you can email us at info@constitutionhilltrust.org. And with that, I hand over to you, Sengezo, to begin tonight's discussion.
Thank you, Londo, and good evening to everybody who has joined us from far and wide, not just in the country, but the world over as well. We would anticipate that a topic of this kind would draw on a wide audience, not just in law, not just in politics, but in the broader space of social sciences in South Africa. My fellow panel members, who I shall have the pleasure indeed to engage this evening, are Albie Sachs, Chantal Ravel, Vali Musa, Lawson Naidu, as well as Tembi Lembete. Of course, each and every single one of my panel members ordinarily would have a title, from judge to doctor to former minister to princess, talking about royalty to counsel and the good old doctor in academic practice. But for ease of reference, one, and also just to level the playing field, if you will, because if you look at everybody else here, bar me, they all have titles. So just to make sure that I can ask questions the way I would otherwise, and also to encourage members of the public to participate the way they otherwise would want to. We have done away with titles. We are all on a first name basis, and that's to encourage debate. There's no anxiety about whether or not our panel members will respect one another. It's implicit in who they are and what they've come to represent in recent times, as well as times past. Electoral reform. Can we build a better democracy? Implicit in the question is, our democracy is clearly not optimal. The events of the last month, the events of the last 3 months, this year to date, of the previous administrations might tell a story which has a recurring theme. There are challenges in the makeup of our democracy. There are some serious constitutional questions that the courts more and more are being invited to answer. Some aspects of the separation of powers are giving and have given anxiety to the establishment. There are times when judges have been referred to as counter-revolutionary, whatever that might mean. Something to do with elections of late is the fact that there is a legitimate question before the IEC, and that is whether or not to have the election on the date initially stipulated by the president in October. There has been an inquiry to that effect commissioned by the IEC, and as qualified of them all, one former Deputy Chief Justice of the Constitutional Court, Dikgang Moseneke, has advised that it's better to defer the elections to a date no later than the end of Feb 2022. Quite the implications that might have for future elections is what in time will unfold. But for present purposes, I think many South Africans are generally engaging themselves in this democracy, engaging themselves in this democracy relative to the history. And more importantly, one might say, are engaging themselves and the future of this country. A lot of that future hangs in the balance, of course, in terms of how we're engaged, key institutions of our democracy, elections being one of them. One man, one vote. I'm not going to ask where that comes from because I know I'm not going to get an answer to that question. But Albie, let me start off with you. You are our resident archivist, if you like. Pearls of wisdom from you are always welcome. Specifically, the question in this one man, one vote phenomenon that we do enjoy now. Why proportional representation of all forms of election and electoral systems that could have been employed by, but were not? How did it come about that the proportional representation prevailed of all the options available?
Right, Songezo, and I'm glad to see without titles you're wearing your Fort hair blazer and I'm wearing my medieval shirt, so we can still have a little bit of swagger.
Indeed,
right.
Thank you.
One man, one vote. We dropped that one man thing about 40 years ago. Strong woman section in the ANC saying one person, one vote. And that became something irresistible in South Africa, but there's nothing in the Freedom Charter that says how do you exercise the vote. It doesn't deal with the electoral system at all. And the issue was put on the table in 1988. I remember it vividly. It was 3 weeks before I was blown up. I still had 2 arms, which I could wave when I'm explaining. And it wasn't I who dealt with the future electoral system in South Africa. It was Kada Asmal. And the moment was an in-house seminar in Lusaka, 70 delegates from all over the world, from the underground, the resistance, MK, administration, top leadership, future constitutional guidelines for a democratic South Africa, with Zambian troops on standby nearby in case commandos came to take us all out. And one of the issues was what electoral system should we have? And Kada came up with 39 different countries' electoral systems. And we all learned about the first past the post, constituency system, PR, proportional representation, single transferable vote, but we didn't take a stand then. It was pretty premature, us in exile, to take a stand on that. But coming back to South Africa, most of us based at UWC, Constitutional Committee of the ANC, Community Law Center, Center for Development Studies, we put on a workshop. It was and a wine farm not far from Stellenbosch, and we were completely open. What sort of electoral system should we have? And we split into 3 groups with plenary sessions. We had somebody from the Liberal Party in England came. He was a strong supporter of a single transferable vote, being the most democratic, but we felt long lists of names in order of preference, complicated to manage. You had to have a literate population to handle it. That was out of the question. And we went through all the different permutations, and we ended up, more or less to our surprise, in each of the 3 groups to support proportional representation. And this was the reason why. First of all, it's the most democratic in terms of representation in your legislative assembly. In England, with 40% of the votes, you can get 60% of the seats. It's very undemocratic and it shuts out a whole lot of voices. That's number 1. Number 2, it was very easy to manage because you didn't, if you have constituencies, you have to draw boundaries. They'd be fighting over the boundaries. Number 3, not only would you fighting over the boundaries, in group areas South Africa, you'd have blacks voting for blacks, you'd have colored voting for colored people, Indians for Indians. You'd be replicating in the constituency system the racial divisions and separateness. We wanted to cut across the separate kind of qualities of that kind. The fourth great advantage was that you could put on your list groups that wouldn't be favored by your strong personality in the local area, usually the strong man. It was very helpful to ensure that women would be well represented. It would be important to ensure that people who had great technical skills, who were been wonderful in the underground resistance, but weren't major public figures, could be in that particular parliament. So these were very strong reasons why we should have proportional representation. But we were worried about the fact that there wasn't direct accountability, which is the very issue the Constitutional Court has raised now. And to meet with that, we decided to have national lists and provincial lists. Provincial lists would give the provinces some say. Not everything would be at the center. But the idea was our first elections would be for the Constitutional Assembly. And we wanted the elections to be clean, clear, representative. We wanted everybody in. We wanted all the small groups in. We didn't want anybody to say, this is not my constitution, I wasn't there. We wanted all the voices there. No proportional representation, with no threshold, no 2% minimum, so that even the small groups could get in. Without, if we'd had 2%, PAC wouldn't have been there, the Democratic Party wouldn't have been there. So we wanted everybody in. But there was a big caveat that's been forgotten. The second elections, we said, should be like the German system, a mixture of PR and constituencies, similar to what we have in the ward system at the local government level. But we all got so used to PR that somehow the idea of the combined system got lost. And now we're back to where we were in 1991. And each of the three groups was unanimous that the best thing for South Africa was PR. I think all the factors I mentioned are still very, very relevant, but the counter proposal has been made to have large constituencies so that you wouldn't have group areas. It would be easier to, you wouldn't be fighting over the delimitations. Large constituencies coupled with PR to top up at the end of the day. So that's the slice of our history that I'm very eager to share with everybody. Thank you.
There certainly shall be an opportunity for you to go to town in some of the points that you have raised as the arguments and the debate develops and sort of morphs into what the panelists have great experience in. For the record, can I just ask all my panel members please to put their videos on? I think it's just easier for debate so that we can also be able to be in sync with one another. Val, if you'll indulge, please. Let me move on to my second guest this evening, Princess Chantal Ravel, but for the purposes of this discussion, she is Chantal. She is an activist and a member of the National Khoi and San Council. Perhaps as you were listening to Albie speak there, Chantal, I think you were itching because of the many important things, and I'm glad he mentioned Group Areas Act, there is a constituency in this country or a community of people in this country who right now, if one were to go to the union buildings, would see them there. They've been camping there for the best part of the president's term. And I don't know to what extent the president has given them audience, but for so long as they are there, I am of the assumption they haven't been given their time before the president. And I think this is a metaphor for the past 27 years, if we are being honest with ourselves. I had the pleasure, which very quickly became the displeasure, of being in Uppington, and I had the rare privilege of being before Mama Katrina Issa. On present facts, she's the only speaker of her native language, 25,000 years of age. That's the Mu language. And I think therein, and we will talk about elections just now, tells a sorry tale of a core constituency of the people in South Africa, be it minority in number, but their value to who we are as a people, I think we need to re-examine. And perhaps then it's small wonder, and I'm going to posit this as a point to which you are more than welcome to disagree. They haven't quite been represented even in the institutions of our democracy. And I wonder what their views are now, what their views were then, when the changes were taking place, were they at the negotiating table? Not necessarily CODESA, but were they at the negotiating table together with their views being considered? And to the extent that they were, what prevailed? How is this electoral system ensuring that their voices are represented from community to parliament, to the constitutional court, to the presidency? Chantal?
Oh, thank you. I've been uh, thinking about these things, and it's just like, it's still to speak on this 27 years of the democracy. It's still touching, because our people still feel that we are the most marginalized group in South Africa. We've never been heard. We never partook. We just like on the outside, so to speak, still fighting for freedom and just a place in South Africa. You asked about, you spoke about, will be part of any negotiations and so forth. No, we were not. From our older leaders that during the reign or the term of Tata Madiba, that is how actually the National Consent Council, which I serve on, actually started way back, because of the exclusion of the Koine San in any negotiation whatsoever. Our views just completely being ignored. It is or was as if we just don't exist. And I think due to that is the fact that we widely more known as a so-called colored group, which is a term that the people that's part of the union buildings absolutely detest. Myself too. We view that term the same as what we call any derogatory name to our other groupings, African groupings. The fact that we were never recognized as Africans even, that was also a fight. It's always been a fight to prove who's more African than the other. And within the electoral system, there's just been no, or political systems, there's just been no voice. You had to follow the rule of the majority and just no voice whatsoever. And it's sad, as you just mentioned, Queen Katrina Iso. Yes, she is one of the speakers still alive who speaks the oldest language in South Africa, which is the new language. I have a very good relationship with her, and I know her story, I know her path. And just recently she's been honored, but I think they gave her a vehicle to travel. But even as we see, there's some form of recognition, and giving her recognition as a living treasure is just not what we thought it should be. It's not fair. You can't cut a whole people group, which is the foundation of South Africa, and the history, that it doesn't matter how you want to explain this, but we've heard things like we just a mixture of black and white, we don't have culture, we don't have, well, in the name color, that might be true, but we're not that. We are so much more. We are the foundation of South Africa, and we have so much to add. There's so much to add to our society and build, and we hold so much knowledge, not only traditional knowledge, but knowledge of accepting people. We were the first to accept every other grouping in South Africa, in Africa, in fact. But we were never allowed to share those views due to a political colored label, I would say. And growing up in South Africa, the way we grew up, we were never taught these things in our history. We were taught something differently, something else. And for the last 27 years, we were waiting and waiting. When will we be part of this democracy? It's just not democracy for us. We've experienced what some might even call apartheid in reverse. We've experienced the BE, we've experienced not being black enough, in fact. Sorry to be so frank about it, but it's just the truth. And now one of our fellow leaders sitting at the union building for 2 years, and it's as if no one knows what to do. And how to, approach these issues and make it like what Albie just spoke about, where everybody's included. And I think it will have to start by acknowledging the true history of South Africa, start acknowledging the people group that weren't included in the first place. And then we can work from there. And people are just, feel that they are being part of what the South Africa is today.
Can I just interrupt you on that point as I move on to my third contributor and panel member this evening, former Minister of Provincial Affairs and Constitutional Development in the first administration of the late Madiba. But before I go on to him, I wish to predicate what I'm going to say to him with this quotation, and I know everybody will know where this comes from. First uttered on 8 May 1996. I owe my being to the Khoi and the San, whose desolate souls haunt the great expanses of the beautiful Cape. They who fell victim to the most merciless genocide our native land has ever seen. They who were the first to lose their lives in the struggle to defend our freedom and independence, and they who, as a people, perished in the result. Today, as a country, we keep an audible silence about these ancestors of the generations that live, fearful to admit the horror of a former deed, seeking to obliterate from our memories a cruel occurrence which, in its remembering, should teach us not and never to be inhumane again. Vali, I come to you because you probably would have been in Parliament that day. I'm saying probably because I simply don't have evidence to say that in fact you were there. But 8 May, President Mbeki launches the Constitution, a glorious day in 1996. Finally, after centuries, we have come to a point where Africans can once be proud. But there are these audible silences that we have kept. It does appear these audible silences are still audible silences of today. Democratic institutions, them being built and built for the people, by the people, are critical, more especially when we can still talk as we do now. What would have been the challenges then, coming from CODESA, the Constitutional Assembly, the Government of National Unity? I know that the 27th April is regarded as the day for Freedom Day, but those days, well, certainly in that year, voting took place over a 3-day period. There were some serious, shall I say, compromises in the time, some of which were very necessary. Also, the fact that we were new to this thing, there were certain things we could not have entirely foreseen. Better than most people, you were at the coalface of these necessary changes that were taking place. Building of institutions, limited resources, deep questions as to the ideology of the party and to what extent it can be the ideology now of the new state. What can you tell us about the period of constitutional development? Vali? Possibly on mute. You're on mute.
Thank you, Songezo. I'll deal with this, the question you put to me, and then make the comments I was going to make on electoral reform. Are you happy with that?
Perfectly so.
Yeah. The question of the Khoisan people, I'm happy that you referred to the I Am an African speech, because that captures it in very few words, but very, very accurately. And I must just say, at the time of CODESA and the multi-party negotiations and the negotiations were not taking place between and among the ethnic and tribal groups of South Africa. At the negotiating table, you had political parties negotiating with each other, and the only entity which was not a political party at the negotiating table was the South African government. And we used to refer to it as the South African government stroke national party. And then you had the ANC and a lot of the other parties that were represented there. But none of the parties were representing ethnic groups. I think we should just bear that in mind when we say that the Khoi and San people were not represented in the negotiations. That's the first thing. The second point to make, and I think probably the more important one, is that the ANC is the only formation that cared about and concerned itself with the unity of the South African nation and the question of redressing the wrongs of the past. But the ANC's theoretical conceptualization of this matter, in my view, was flawed and still is flawed. Because very central to the ANC is the concept of African. And when we talk about African in the ANC, and when the ANC talks about it, it's not talking about white people, and it's not talking about people of Indian origin. But it also lumped into that the notion of colored, which I think, as the princess has said, is a nebulous, poorly defined, and often derogatory term as such. What in the conceptualization of African, the Khoisan people were not included. Now, you know, if you look at one particular speech, you will say, well, there's evidence that the Khoisan people were also referred to as African, but it wasn't really the case. And when the ANC spoke about one of the primary objectives of the struggle is the liberation of the African people, it lumped the Khoisan people and people of Khoisan origin together with a group of people that were referred to as colored people. And I think that was a conceptual fault in the ANC's thinking for many, many decades throughout the struggle, and which has seeped through even up to now. So as a result of which, what we have is lip service to restoration of the wrongs that were done to the Khoisan people. So I think that actually is just and I wouldn't say just the ANC. I think it's a problem in South African society that runs right across very deep. What adds to the difficulty of dealing with this matter is that, unlike any other ethnic group in South Africa, the Khoi and San tribal tribes of that time, suffered genocide. And it was the policy of the colonialists to wipe them out. That's what it was. And unlike what happened with other African tribes, where the policy was to subjugate and put them to work, having subjugated the African tribes, put them to work on the farms and put them to work in the mines as migrant workers. With the Khoisan groups, it was to exterminate them and bring in slaves from other parts of the world to do the work on the farms and the other sort of work. So that was a very different, as a result of which the fabric of those communities was impacted upon and destroyed to such an extent that for most of the years of the struggle, those formations were not able to express voice in the liberation movement, not just in the ANC, but in the liberation movement more broadly. And that's a problem that we're sitting with today. And it's for that reason why in the Constitution, it seemed perfectly rational to say, you've got to have a cutoff date for the restoration of land which was stolen, and that is the 1913. Because of 1913 is a good point, you've got to choose some sort of date. That's a good point because that's when because of the 1913 Land Act. But that had nothing to do with the Khoisan groups as such. There was also, I mean, there is reference to Khoisan in the Constitution, the Pan-African Language Board and Culture Board. All of those are required to promote the culture and languages of the Khoisan people. But so one can be technical about this thing and point to various sorts of things. But in the end, I think we have a problem in this country that needs to be solved. And it's more of a moral and ethical problem. And because of the genocide and because of the breakdown of the fabric and structure of these communities, they don't pose a political problem for the country as such. You know, it's just too few people, too atomized to be able to vote, to pose either a threat during elections for any of the political. So none of the political parties are concerned because none of them see their electoral fortunes tied to this question. And you know, withdrawal of labor or any other kind of protest action doesn't pose a general political threat. So that's what I would say, Songezo. And I think we have a problem and we need to come to terms with it. Other nations are coming to terms with it. If you look at in Australia, there's been a huge movement around this matter and the treatment of the First Nations in Australia. And remember a few years ago, they had a national sorry day, say sorry day. In Canada, right now, in fact, this year in 2021, for the first time, you're finding large scale interest in this matter, regret being expressed, and a question of restitution being spoken about because of the treatment, the genocidal treatment of the First Nations by the colonialists in Canada. South Africa is one country, I mean, South Africa is like the United States. We haven't come to terms with this thing. And we as the nation, we can't say it was those people, it was the white colonialists who did the genocide. We as a South African nation must say, we, our nation in South Africa, we had genocide that happened here. And part of the way in which South Africa has turned out today, it's because of the treatment of the First Nations. And we need to come to terms with it. We haven't come to terms with it. And I think we're still a long way. And it's not a technical and legal thing. It's much more of a deeply moral and psychological thing that we need to deal with, Songezo. So that's my view. I've thought about this matter long and hard. As you say, when I was Minister for Constitutional Development, I interacted with the Khoisan representatives a great deal. But I made very little progress, partly because the nation is not interested in it as yet. And Thabo Mbeki, who was the president at the time, as you can see, very correctly conceptualized what the issue is. He captured it very well. And that's where his heart is, I know. And many other people, in fact, even Madiba. But unless the South African nation wants to come to terms with it, you know, we will continue to ignore the matter. That's what I can say. So it's a big and complex and complicated question which we need to address. And unless we can say that it's our collective shame, we won't come to terms with this matter as such. And it's not just a question of recognizing somebody as the legitimate chief or this or that or whatever else. The practical things that come up is that the remnants of the Khoisan tribes don't enjoy the same status as the other African tribes, and that's a practical thing. But if I may go on to the electoral systems question, I want to just...
Yeah, very briefly, please. Sure.
I want to just thank LB for the background that he's given. And I think that he correctly characterizes why we had decided, correctly so, on a proportional representation system and why proportional representation is still the correct thing even today, 30 years from now. He also pointed quite correctly to why the first democratic elections was conducted in a manner in which it was. We went for a straightforward black and white PR system with national and provincial lists at the time. And the reason we went for that was a variety of reasons, one of which is we didn't have a voters' roll. We wanted everybody just to go and vote wherever they are. There was no voter registration. You could vote at any polling station. We didn't have a common citizenship, so there wasn't a common ID document by which you could recognize who is a citizen and who not. So we had a variety of ways, including informal ways of recognizing somebody's citizenship and right to vote. And those elections took place over 3 days. The counting was more or less correct, but was only more or less correct. It wasn't correct as such. And everybody knew that in some parts of the country, there was stuffing of ballot boxes, counting was done wrong, etc. So it wasn't really a real election, as you would say. It was a political moment, and it was part of a political process. And the only thing the Constitution said is that proportional representation is important because voter preference must be reflected in the composition of parliament and government. And so that's what it said. It then left the detail to parliament. And at that time, the view was quite clearly that a pure PR system on its own, just with lists, is not good enough. That you need to have something more nuanced, something more sophisticated than that. And we have reached a point now where, and you know that I headed up the ministerial committee on advisory committee on electoral.
We'll talk about that in a minute. Please don't resist the temptation.
Oh, we're coming back to that. Okay, if we're coming back to that, that's fine. I thought you wanted me to talk about the electoral reform thing. I'll come back to that, Wayne, if you want me to.
Certainly, no, I do appreciate that indulgence because I actually do want to sort of move along the times. We've had the historical accounts coming through from LB as well as Chantel, and I do appreciate the work that you were seized with in those early days in building democratic institutions and making sure that accountability was now something that was directed at and in line with the Constitution. And of course, despite what challenges there have been, I think we can fairly say that our electoral system does, for the most part, then it doesn't represent the will of the people. And it is something which is readily ascertainable without the challenges of 1904. In fact, you take me back to an interview I had with Johan Krichler sometime in 2019 when he had said that we knew there were people who were coming from SADC region to come and cast their vote for the ANC. And he went on to say in these words, and I'm paraphrasing, those sorts of things in that sort of election, you simply let go. So I appreciate the honesty and the reinforcement of the fact that there were certain things which wouldn't stand constitutional muster now, but had become part of the 94 project. But Lawson, 94 has come and gone. There are state institutions for the purposes of accountability and responsiveness. And we have seen in the life of South Africa 27 years into this democracy, there have been many things that ultimately, when you look at the challenge, the electoral system and the extent to which South Africans themselves have a say in what happens. Look at what happened in 94, look what happened in 99. The fact that there was a government of national unity, and I want to call it a compromised situation or an expeditious situation just to ensure that we stabilize a democracy. But then the reality of a democracy dawned on us. And then the Department of Home Affairs under Shenge at the time, of course, in the administration of President Mbeki, commissioned Frederick van Zyl-Slabbert to have a look at this very question of elections. There was that controversial system of floor crossing, which thankfully didn't last longer than the 6 years it did between 2002 and 2008 when Olomisa intervened. So he'd like us to believe anyway. 2008, over a weekend, certain members of a political party decided to go and visit a sitting head of state and tell him to resign within the week. He duly did so. History would repeat itself 10 years on, 2018, only it was not the love that South Africa would have wanted or had for its president. In Valentine's Day, the president at the time resigned because he was facing the threat of being voted out of office through a vote of no confidence in parliament. New Nation movement comes and says, despite what the Constitution says, and that is, let me just read for clarity's sake, the Republic of South Africa is one sovereign democratic state founded on the following values, among other things, multi-party system of democratic government. Here, the Constitutional Court, in this 2020 judgment through Nation Movement, says an individual can stand for high office. We are now seized with a situation where elections have to be deferred because the conditions don't quite suit. To say the electoral system will only be as strong and as robust as the conditions on the ground allow, Lawson, you're at the forefront of electoral reform through the work of the Center for the Advancement of the South African Constitution. From where you sit and stand, give us a bird's eye view of some of these challenges that you are looking to address.
Thank you, Songezo. There's a lot in that, so let me try and unpack it briefly, if I can. I think the issue of our choice of proportional representation has been adequately covered by Vali and Albi already in terms of why we chose that model, because of its inclusivity, that every vote would count and everybody would feel a part of the democratic South Africa. So it was an important part of that process. It was simple. It was easy to administer in the '94 election. But the interim constitution also said that that system would be in place for 2 elections, for '94 and '99, and that there had to be a review. There was a constitutional mandate for a review of that system, which ended up, as you refer, to the Van Zyl-Slabbert task team that then reported to cabinet. And the majority view of that task team was that we should amend the electoral system to a hybrid system with the PR and a multi-member constituency, 69 multi-member constituencies with between 3 and 7 representatives in each of those constituencies. That didn't go anywhere at the time. It was perhaps, with hindsight, a missed opportunity to properly review the electoral model that we have in South Africa, whether the recommendation of the majority of the Van Zyl-Slabbert task team was the appropriate model for South Africa I'm not sure is the real point, but we missed an opportunity to have a debate, a national debate at that time about what electoral system was suitable for South Africa 10 years into democracy. So it really was a missed opportunity, and we presented, fortunately, within the same lifetime. We have another opportunity now, but I'll come back to that in a moment. I mean, the fact that we had a government of national unity for 2 years from '94 to '96, I don't think it was a product of the electoral system. It was a political choice that the African National Congress made at the time, that this was what was necessary to manage the political transition in South Africa. But what was important about the '94 election, as others have said, is that it was inclusive. We had 7 political parties represented in the National Assembly after the 1994 election. Today, we have 14 political parties in that same National Assembly. So we can see how the electoral system has worked over that period of time. And this issue of inclusivity and visual representation of people in Parliament was really important. Back then, Songezo, I worked as for the Speaker of the National Assembly, Frene Jimbola. And one of the things that she insisted upon in that first Parliament was that every political party that was represented should have a front bench. Even the PAC with its 2 members needed to have a front bench. Because as she put it, it was important for people of South Africa who are watching Parliament on television to see their representatives there, and to see their representatives being accorded the status that those voters had accorded to them. So it was really important that the choices of the electorate were visibly able to be seen. Coming to the floor crossing issue, I mean, I think we can just describe it with hindsight as a failed experiment to try and address the issues of political realignment or the realignment of political parties, some that were disappearing from the scene and others that were emerging. And this was a mechanism that we used, thankfully, as you say, short-lived, but to try and assist and manage that process. It perhaps succeeded to some extent, although I think, again, hindsight will tell us that the major benefactor of floor crossing was the largest party, the African National Congress, who benefited most from that process of floor crossing. I mean, I think the removal from office, the recall of both Presidents Mbeki and Zuma, shows the limitations of the electoral system and the parliamentary system, because in neither case was Parliament the prime instigator of the removal of the president. It was done at the behest of the political party, and it was merely a formality in terms of the resignation being recorded in Parliament, and Parliament then needing to fill the vacancy by electing a new president. But the actual stepping down of that president had little to do with Parliament itself. As we know, in the case of the former President Zuma, there were a number of motions of no confidence against him in Parliament. All of them failed to remove him. As a result of those, we had a matter in the Constitutional Court, the so-called secret ballot case, which determined that it was permissible for Parliament to hold a motion of no confidence through a secret ballot. That was indeed held, and a number of ANC MPs were able to vote in favor of that motion, but not sufficient to remove the president from office. We then end up just over a year ago, 13 months ago now, nearly 14 months ago, with the judgment of the Constitutional Court again in the New Nation Movement case. And the judgment is narrow in its ambit, in that it simply says that the Electoral Act is unconstitutional to the extent that it does not provide for independent candidates to contest national and provincial elections. So there could be a very simple and technical resolution to that, to implement that judgment, to simply allow independents and individual candidates to stand without fundamentally altering the electoral system. But I think, as has been argued and has been accepted, this now provides us with an opportunity to really rethink and refashion that electoral model. And this is an issue we'll come back to, so let me not get into any detail around that. But I think it does. I think that the reason why the timing is so appropriate is that, having come out of our recent history, where we've seen the failure of Parliament to be able to exercise its constitutional mandate, its primary constitutional mandate to hold the executive to account. We've seen the failures of Parliament. We've been listening to the evidence at the state capture inquiry about how Parliament failed in the face of state capture to do anything about it. And that lack of accountability of our elected representatives plays out in how those representatives fail to then hold the executive to account. So I think this is an opportune moment for the issue of electoral reform to be back on the agenda. And it's taken a court decision to get us here. But now that we are here, we need to seize the moment. Thanks, Duncan.
We certainly do. Thank you, Lawson. Much appreciated for that. Talking about the Carpe Diem moment, because you mentioned the fact that, and I think it was quite a wise call on the part of Mamafrini Jinwala to make sure that the faces of Parliament were indeed faces of Parliament and that they sit in front. Unfortunately, the reality is those faces who were sitting there in 94 for the most part are still there. Look at the ACDP, look at the IFP, look at the UDM from the date of its founding. And many members of the ANC flaunt, if you like, their credentials. I've been a member of this Parliament for all of its democratic life. And that's probably part of the problems that we have in this country, to the extent that we are now starting to see unravel. And perhaps it has created quite a big opportunity for some of the new parties. You mentioned that there are 14 in the current Parliament. One of those 14 is quite visible, quite known, and quite loud. Parliament, certainly from 2014, has not for the most part been the same as it would have been and might have been in its life before. And that is because one young 34-year-old decided to shake things up. And shake things up he did, even though they would shake him up again at the State of the Nation in 2015. But Dr. Mbete, you were part of this Ministerial Advisory Committee on Electoral Systems, and some of clearly what we are talking about now would have found space there. And I'm asking this question to you because you were the spokesperson. Vali will have his views because he was the chairperson on that. But specifically, we are at this point now because young people feel very disenfranchised. I make only this point. Currently, the EFF is sitting on 45 seats. None of the UDM, the IFP, the NNP, the DP, the ACDP, the Freedom Front, the PAC have ever breached 45 seats in all of the time they've contested national elections. I deliberately do not say National Party at the time of 94 because they did, and I do not mention the DA because it's a combination of the Democratic Party and the New National Party. But the EFF has come in and has done things that clearly resonate with 45 seats in that parliament, which their predecessors have not been able to do. Therein is an indication that, if you like, the people in parliament and the systems that get them there need serious revision. Your thoughts, please, Thembi.
Thanks so much for that question, and thank you for the invitation to be here with you. I would like to just say, in terms of that, South Africa's proportional representation system, and thank you, LB, for setting out so well what the background is of the system, has evolved in a way that is very different theoretically to what's usually expected of proportional representation systems. So usually a PR system allows for a proliferation of political parties, and then because all votes count and people can find a political party to vote for that best represents them, knowing that they are likely to get a seat in parliament, it usually means that you get coalition governments coming out of PR systems, and you don't get major dominance of one party over the system as a whole. That kind of dominance usually comes from first past the post type elections. What's been different in South Africa and in Namibia, which also has a PR system for its parliamentary elections, is that our PR systems have resulted in the dominance of one political party, in the South African case, the ANC. Part of the ANC's electoral dominance is partly explained actually by the floor crossing legislation, because in those years, even though floor crossing was only around for 6 years, it enabled the ANC to absorb many smaller parties, or the votes of the support of many smaller parties, and made it increased its support far more than it otherwise would have done if there was no floor crossing legislation. So I make that point to say that the situation that we have, where the third biggest party in parliament, being the EFF, has 45 seats and has breached that 40 seats in a way that numerous other parties have not been able to in the past, is not a function of the electoral system. It's a function of the political system that we have and the dominance of the ANC within that political system. And that is important for me to highlight, because one of the things that we really were aware of as the Ministerial Advisory Committee, and Vali can speak more about that, and many of the people that made submissions to the committee, is that an electoral system is not the be-all and end-all of a political system. It's one component of the broader political system, but an electoral system is not going to fix our accountability problem. It's not going to fix many of the ills, our problems with corruption or ethics, or all of those ills that we have in our system. However, what an electoral system does, and all an electoral system is converting votes into seats in parliament. It's converting votes into representation. And what we can do is we can enhance our electoral system so that that process of converting votes into seats can be seen as more legitimate. It can enhance the relationship between voters and their representatives. And those are some of the issues that we were then discussing as a committee, as we were thinking of how to advise the minister Africa to implement the Constitutional Court judgment from June last year on the issues that Chantal and the New Nation movement and others brought forward to the Constitutional Court.
I would be interested in Chantal precisely on that point. Thank you so much there, Dr. Mehta, because Chantal, clearly, if we agree, and I don't think there can be anybody to gainsay that votes equal seats, and that's the system which on present facts is the fairest and the most practical and the best in consideration of everything. There is a considerable concern on that account alone for a community like the Khoi and the San, because they will scarcely get those seats if they don't get those votes, because those votes are linked to a community and a community in number. So then from your perspective, what then would be the response to get those votes, which are going to have the same weight as all the other votes? So at a minimum to ensure that the communities, although small in number, but who've got as legitimate a claim in South Africa Pty Ltd, are at the table where the decisions are being made, are not just listening to the conversation, but are making the conversation, are there, so that we don't have this issue that Vali referred to, that nobody actually is interested in this country. It has a similar US problem in recognizing a genocide that has taken place, and it's not on the agenda of any party because it's not linked to any party's political fortunes.
You know, just listening to all the responses, I was looking at the judgment, and we referred to myself as the second applicant, and it states that that I'm a representative of and a leader of a nation, and you know, being accountable directly to the people and not being shackled down and answerable to a party, you know, and through all the conversations here, with even the recent emergency now in KZN, and people, you know, just it seems like they've lost all morals and people just want to fight and then turn it into a political disagreement and all of that. You know, it does come down to numbers, but I was reading about Tata Madiba earlier on, his autobiography, where he just referred to his style of leadership, and where he said that it's rather nurture than nature. And if you look from a Khoisan perspective at the political system, it never would have worked. You know, we had our own customary law systems, and we were order, and we were respect for human dignity and all of that. And it's still enshrined within the people. And I know we're up against numbers, and we will never get that right. But we can have an influence over every people group in the country that is understood in the right context, and we nurture it in that way, you know, and bring our part of being completely left out and not even having a say in that due to these numbers and democracy. It just don't work. And, you know, so many things could have been different if we had that place at the table 27 years ago. That's all I can say.
So we get into the nuances there, Stambula. Thank you for probing this particular point. And I'm going to harp a little bit on the votes equal to seats and the fact that electoral systems alone do not necessarily guarantee all the other institutional aspirations, if you like. Let me come to you, Lawson, because Stambula mentioned the fact that, for instance, we're not necessarily going to get accountability from simply having an electoral system the way that it is. Accountability is responsiveness. The fact that those two are absent, it means invariably transparency will not exist. The core of the Constitution is Section 195. The fact that an electoral system doesn't quite have the ability to achieve certain outcomes, do we then engage the electoral system? And I know I'm getting into the terrain of the Ministerial Advisory Committee on Electoral System Reforms here, and I'm coming to Vali last because I want him to have the benefit of these thoughts. If we know certain things are not being achieved, part of that could be a question of engaging the electoral system or the Constitution and other mechanics of the Constitution. where, and probably you can delve into your submissions there, should we look to start correcting?
Thanks, Ungezo. Look, I mean, I think what Sitembile has just said is a good departure point. You know, an electoral system is merely a mechanism of allocating political power. It's nothing more, nothing less than that. And to blame an electoral system for other failures, failures of accountability, of not being able to achieve the objectives or the vision of the Constitution, is totally misplaced. I think we've got to accept the limitations of what an electoral system can be. You know, and it's not to say that we don't need to review and revise our electoral system. But, you know, if you can look at, you know, electoral models across the world, you see similar models in different countries produce very different outcomes and very different results. So you can't use the electoral system as a mechanism to fix the ills that we have, of the lack of accountability, of impunity towards corruption and state capture, and the like, and, you know, perhaps even delving to the issues of the quality of our elected representatives even. So that's not the place of it. You know, CASAC commissioned a study, I think it was 6 years ago, by Professor Stephen Friedman on the nexus between political electoral systems and accountability. And his conclusion was that, well, yes, you can change the electoral system, but in itself, it's not going to change anything else, unless you have a whole series of other things that happen, which is about our political culture and people becoming more involved and exerting the political power that we as individuals, as ordinary citizens have, in order to extract that accountability. That accountability doesn't happen automatically. So I think it's really important to say that. But having said that, I think there is an issue around the debate on electoral systems, because it's based on a number of principles. So there's the issue of accountability, there's the issue of fairness, there's the issue of inclusivity of the electoral model that we use, and those sorts of issues. Now, I think we all agree that the fairest system is the system we currently have, where every vote counts and every vote is recognized. But it's clearly failed to deliver the kind of accountability that we
Quickly, Lawson, is fairness equity? Is fairness equity?
Well, you know, it depends what your measuring tool is. If you're looking at fairness and equity, then it's probably equates there. But if you want to address the issue of accountability as well, then you know, these are trade-offs that any electoral model that has to engage in. And so, you know, the opportunity to review that electoral model now is to say, well, can we do it in a way that maintains the general proportionality that the Constitution requires of an electoral process, while instituting some form of constituency system, whether it be a multi-member constituency system that I referred to earlier, or as the CASAC proposal to Valley's ministerial team was, that we should have a single-member constituencies as well as a PR list system. So those are but you know, those are all trade-offs, and we need to engage with those things and say, what is it that's going to help us to deliver a deeper and strengthened democracy? But in itself, if we don't do a series of other things, it's not going to deliver that on its own.
Albi, let's pretend we are in 1990, 1991, and you have the benefit of what CASAC is now saying before Vali Musa's committee. Let's assume that the Van Zyl-Slabbert report was available to yourselves at that time, where clearly there is strength or an undercurrent that does support not exclusively a proportional representation system, but let me use the word hybrid because it has been used before, but that does contemplate the constituency aspect, precisely because the PR doesn't cover all eventualities or doesn't cover all constituencies fairly. And I use the word advisedly because I don't know which better one to use, so that you don't have these marginalized communities who have genuine concerns not being addressed simply because they don't have the number to back them. How might things have turned out?
Well, if you're asking, what do I feel now looking back? I'm very attracted to the Van Zyl-Slabbert Commission's overall balancing of the competing interests. I hate the idea of group areas constituencies, where you often get people demagogic, appealing to the particular interests of that particular community, and then doing deals with others, and the racism gets right into Parliament, and the ethnic thing as well. So they deal with that by having multi-member constituencies. But at the same time, you're quite close to the people. You can give them hell. When I lived in England in exile, Saturday morning, all the MPs would have what they call a surgery. And you could go to your MP and give the MP hell. Or if your brother-in-law was arrested in Thailand, you could go to MP and get some support for that. There's like a personal connection, and they're interested in attending to where you are. The downside of also small constituencies, if your person loses, you feel we're not represented at all. We're out. So the multi-member constituencies, which Van Zyl-Slabbert, a majority, including ANC members, supported, I would favor something like that. Not so much the German system, ensuring that PR comes through at the end. I don't think that would help the princess. For me, it's very remarkable. She was a litigant, went to the highest court in the land to ask for direct representation, even although, as it turns out, there's very little chance because of the decimation of the numbers that they will be represented. But what I'm so proud of, Songeso, is we have an open society. We debate these issues. We can say what we want. And we're having very serious discussions. And we're revealing the dirt. We're revealing the corruption. We're sending people to jail who deserve to go to jail. We did something right. It's not that everything is kind of negative. And we're feeling the pains. And this is a marvelous time for revision, as Luanda said at the beginning, for rethinking. I think the great majority of our people have a deep respect for our democracy, our open society. They want it to work. They want it to work better. They don't want to destroy it. And I think these debates and discussions are enormously helpful in that respect. I wish I could just be Albie and not a former judge. Sometimes I can't speak out. I don't have freedom of speech, but I can get it quite a lot in my own way. And that's more or less the way I feel.
Well, that's precisely why we call you Albie. We don't want to give you the title of judge because we actually want Albie to speak Albie's mind. Vali, hold a thought for a second. I'm coming back to your contemporary.
Can I just sort of interrupt to add one thing? We were very idealistic in 1991. If we'd used constituencies, it would have been enormously helpful to the ANC. With 60% of votes, we would have had 80% of the seats. And we said we don't want that. Then people will say this is an ANC constitution. We wanted the fairest thing. We wanted this to be our gift to the nation, to posterity. And I think that's the kind of thinking we need, not just in the ANC, but in all parties, to think of not what's going to help us, but what gift can we come that will give us renown for being principled and be something for our children and grandchildren.
Stembile, I'm coming to you, and I recognize your guest in the background there. Greetings. Stembile, the fact that Albie refers to something, and the use of that word is quite striking, the surgeries where MPs on weekends literally go to their people and hear first-hand accounts of the lived experiences, of their thoughts, and 2 days on, they can then go and voice those very issues that they would have fielded on the Saturday. That's not necessarily in this current climate, in this current system, an impossibility. No one particular rule for that matter has to change for that to happen. Of course, they largely are inaccessible. They have a parliamentary village in Cape Town. If you do see them, a lot of them are in motorcades. So just even from that perspective, they are inaccessible. Never mind the fact that they generally are not accessible because they are not where the people are. How do we engage then that form of accountability where MPs, I know they say they do constituency work, and I'm not necessarily an expert in terms of what actually happens in constituency work, but the reality is one doesn't get the impression that our MPs or public representatives are as readily available to us here as to the example Albie mentioned earlier on. Have you come across a system where that could be addressed? Are any of the arguments that were put to you guys in the Ministerial Advisory Committee responsive to the question of accountability and relatability of MPs, so that we not necessarily engage in the question of the electoral system, but rather the system of representation, if that makes sense?
Yes, that does make sense. And many of the responses that we had and the submissions that we had were really around that issue. People saying that our public representatives are inaccessible, they are not directly accountable to us, and we want them to be, we want a system that'll make them directly accountable to us. Because the reason why there were those surgeries, as LB says, in the UK was because MPs need to keep reaching out to their constituencies if they want to be re-elected. In South Africa, what we have together with the proportional representation system is that we've got a system of constituencies that's managed by Parliament, and MPs are meant to do, each MP is meant to have a constituency office and do constituency work on a Monday. But because of the electoral system that we have that empowers political parties so much, and that means that MPs really have to keep their party bosses happy more than they have to keep their constituents happy, there's no incentive really for MPs to engage fully and properly in the constituency work that they have. So a number of the suggestions that we had, including from KSAC, was about creating constituencies, having some kind of mixed system where we bring in a constituency element and we enable that direct representation and therefore direct accountability, so that the electorate will be able to say, well, I live in this part of Johannesburg, and I know that my representative in Parliament is this person. And if that person does not vote the way that I want them to in Parliament, if they don't support or mobilize around what's important to me, I can hold that person accountable, and they have to account to me. And so part of what we were grappling with in the committee was how to include that kind of direct accountability in order to address this issue of representation in our political system.
Thank you. Thank you for coming through, because I'm glad you answered the way that you did, because I am sort of escalating, if you will, the conversation. And I come back to you, Vali, whilst you turn your video on. You were the chairperson of this Ministerial Advisory Committee commissioned by Aaron Motsoaledi, which pretty much mirrors what would have happened some 18 years before with Shenge Buthelezi and Van Zyl Slabbert. Now, you have the hindsight of every question around the electoral system in this country. You've got all of that information to you, and you have put together a report and sent it back to the commissioner, being Aaron Motsoaledi. I don't know how much of that report is one public information and is declassified. So I'm giving you all the all the rope to speak to the extent that you are of the view you can about not the terms of reference, but the outcomes of the participants, what the theme that is now overriding, because we hear from Lawson that the overriding theme was a missed opportunity on the hybrid system. What do we have before us now that you are at least hopeful will be addressed? That it is implemented or not doesn't necessarily mean it has not been addressed, bearing in mind everything that has been said, because I do get the sense there is a strong desire if not need, to adopt a more constituency-based approach, if you like, the hybrid system. Also, in your response, could you contemplate something that Albie mentioned earlier, in view of the municipal demarcations? If that had been the system in place at the time, constituency-based that is, it would have not only favored the ANC, but it would have had an undesirable effect of white people electing white people, Africans electing Africans, and the colored people electing colored people, and probably the Indian people electing Indian people. The challenges that would have occasioned, also bearing in mind the thesis of what it is that you have remitted back to Motsoaledi.
Thank you very much, Sangezo. Let me just say in broad terms, the pure proportional representation system was good for the first election, and it was the intention at that time that it will be revised after that. The second thing to say is that, let me start off with responding to some of the things which Albie Sex has said, because he's a powerhouse, and it's better for me to pick on the strong rather than pick on the weak. I'm not commenting on anybody else.
Don't say that too loudly, Bali.
But before I go there, let me just say, when I started this work of heading up the Ministerial Advisory Committee on Electoral Reform, I was very skeptical about the Constitutional Court judgment. Prior to that, I was not certain as to whether the Constitutional Court had taken the correct decision, where Princess and the New Nation people were the applicants. I thought the court, because they didn't understand the electoral system properly, took such a decision. But when I got into the detail of it, I became a big supporter of the court judgment. I must tell you that. So right now, I'm a big supporter of it. Albie Sex mentioned that one of the reasons we chose a national list system, and generally a list system, is because at the time we thought that cadres of the movement who had made a big contribution in the freedom struggle were not popular at a public level and therefore may not get to parliament. But the list system will allow us to put them into the list. And in the same vein, he mentioned that people with the right kind of technical skills, and presumably he meant intellectual skills, would not be able to get into parliament because they are not popular amongst the masses. And a list system will allow us to put that. But I must say that the list system allows, in fact, the opposite. It allows for abuse. It allows for a kind of deployment of people who support the faction that is dominant in any party. And both the EFF, the DA, and the ANC have shown that you put into the list the people who support the leader at any particular point in time, not necessarily people who are skilled, technically skilled, who can bring skills to parliament. And therefore, there were moments in parliament where we didn't have the right kind of skills as a result of which. And that balance doesn't always apply. And then often people put the wrong people in parliament, people who've been accused of fraud and corruption and whom the public doesn't like, but which a party can say, but this person has an illustrious contribution in the struggle or in the party, and they put in. So that is what we've had. The next point to make about, Albie makes the point that we didn't want ethnic groups to vote for their own people and for group and to have a group area type of representation in parliament. I must say it was right 30 years ago, but it's not correct right now. There was a thinking more than a generation ago. Right now, throughout the world, it is accepted that often people want to see one of their own in parliament. That's what they want to see. And that is, it's not whether it's right or wrong, it's the reality. And if you don't have that, you're going to have a problem. I don't agree that the Khoisan people will not have a representation if you have direct elections if you have smaller constituencies, because there are the parts of Northern Cape that you're talking about, in fact, would be those areas. And there are many parts of the country, including the Western Cape, I think, where you would have that kind of representation coming in. And in fact, it's the only way in which you will have that kind of representation coming in, because none of the three big political parties are interested in this question. And so when we looked at this matter, the Van Zyl-Slabbert report was a good report for the time, but it didn't provide for independent candidates to run for parliament. It didn't satisfy the requirement in the Constitution, which we now understand as a result of the Constitutional Court judgment on the 11th of June 2020, which said that the Constitution says that every citizen has a right to vote and to stand for elections, and if elected, go to parliament. That the Van Zyl-Slabbert report doesn't meet that requirement because it had large constituencies which would mimic the provinces and national, where you would have party lists, and it doesn't provide for independence. Many years later, we had what was called the Kgalema-Motlanthe high-level report on reforms that were needed. And former President Motlanthe then recommended that we should have single-member constituencies in order to improve the system. Now, some people say if we have single-member constituencies, that it wouldn't solve the problem of fraud and corruption. That is absolutely correct, because the biggest fraud and corruption imaginable in the Republic, and maybe for many generations to come, was conducted under the Zuma administration, which was elected on a purely proportional representation thing. So it's true that the electoral system doesn't solve that. That's a criminal justice matter, and it should be dealt with at that sort of level. And it doesn't solve, as Lawson has said, every and any problem on earth. But it does give members of the public confidence in the political system. Everything that we've heard, especially from the younger generation, is they say, we don't know how these people end up in parliament. Why can't we decide who should go to parliament and who should not go to parliament? And that is why the majority you asked whether this is a public report. The minister hasn't published it, but it's all over in the newspaper, so I may as well talk about it. The majority in the committee were of the view, retain the proportional outcome, one, because the Constitution requires it, but two, because it's the only fair modern system. You can't have the kind of UK type system where a minority of votes puts a party in government. So retain that, but create a hybrid system, have single member constituencies rather than multi-member constituencies, so that in the constituencies you don't have PR lists, you have individual standing, and the political parties will then have to put up individuals. And right now you have many individuals getting to parliament to hide in political lists. A single member constituency approach will make it necessary for the parties to say, here is Sithembile Mbete. She's a great person. She will represent you well. And the public can judge her and test her, whether she's in a party or not. So that's really the approach. If we don't do that, we run the risk of the younger generation losing confidence in the political system. And we have the risk of people doing what we saw in the riots recently, where if they feel the political system doesn't represent them, they express themselves in other sorts of ways. And I think we're sitting on a powder keg, and this is the right time for us to reform the system and to introduce and to tell political parties, if they are so confident that they've got the right people in their lists, they should then feel confident enough to put them up to public scrutiny. Right now, only the leader of the party is put up to public scrutiny, nobody else on the list. So in the ANC, President Ramaphosa in the next election will say, vote for us, I'm a good man. I think he's a good man, and a lot of people will vote for him. And then you'll have in the DA, you'll have the leader of the DA and the EFF doing the same sort of thing. They don't need to put anybody else up to scrutiny. But this does not bring into question the proportional outcome. That is absolutely important, and that is what needs to be done. I'm having done this work in a committee, I'm completely convinced that unless we do this, we're not going to be building on our proportion. We've got it in the local government elections, by the way. And I must say that for the National Assembly, you'll have 200 constituencies. So these are going to be large constituencies. For local government, we have about over 4,000 constituencies. So you're going to have hundreds of constituency or municipal wards making up one National Assembly constituency. And most of those are not going to end up along group area lines. These are very, very large constituencies. Like in any country in the world, parliamentary constituencies tend to be quite large. They don't just revolve around one village or one township in general as such. So I think that's where we are. And I must thank the New Nation people, and I must thank Princess and her people. I think very disempowered people got the Constitutional Court to take a very big decision, something that we neglected. We undertook to address this after the first elections. We didn't do so. We ignored Van Zyl-Slabbit's report. We ignored the Kgalema Motlanthe recommendations. And I think now it's something that we must deal with. Let me conclude by saying the instinct of those political parties who are in power, the three big political parties, would be not to do this, because they would not want to be challenged by independent candidates. All three of those political parties have got some of their own members who would prefer to run as independents. The conclusion I want to make before you stop me is that I don't know if any of you have looked at what is happening in the outcome of the local government elections in El Dorado Park, which is a so-called colored township in Johannesburg. The party that has been winning all of the local wards is a party called the Patriotic Alliance. And I believe the reason that the people in El Dorado Park have been voting for the Patriotic Alliance is because they do not feel represented by the EFF, DA, or the ANC. I don't want to say much about the Patriotic Alliance because I may be accused of being wrong in this. I will just read you the one sentence from Wikipedia. This is how they describe the Patriotic Alliance. The Patriotic Alliance is a South African political party formed in November 2013 by, among others, one-time convicted bank robber turned motivational speaker, author and businessman, Gayton McKenzie, and former convicted fraudster turned businessman and socialite Kenny Kunene. Now, when communities do not feel represented in the current system, and you don't have the ANC, DA, or EFF putting up credible people, this is what you find. And I think we need a reform of the electoral system so that political parties are forced to put up good quality people who can stand up to public scrutiny. Thank you, Sandesh.
Yes. I can't resist the temptation insofar as what you read out from Wikipedia to say, one, anybody could have written that because Wikipedia is that accessible. And two, the kind of membership that you spoke about insofar as it relates to representing the Patriotic Alliance, frankly speaking, absent court judgments, they exist in the ANC, in the DA, as well as the EFF. We just don't have the benefit of convictions in that regard. Let me take the time now to engage the listeners who have participated on our online platform. There are 5 questions. I'm going to literally address all 5 questions to one each of you. Allow me, please, benefit of just reading all of the questions, and then I will confirm to whom I am asking this question. Our cause is in Danjana to you, Albie Sachs. Time for electoral reform is indeed ripe now in our country. However, one has to consider the increased registration fees for political parties and individual candidates. How will this affect individual candidates who may not have financial muscle to run for office, a fundamental civic and political right? Further, doesn't this barrier to entry increase the risk of corruption in politics and normalize value for money over sound policies, government programs, and better, for lack of a better word, candidates? Isn't this an impediment to our democratic order? Albi Sex, that was to you from Ako Ndanjana. Thank you so much, Ako, for that. After Albi, I come to you, Lawson Naidu, a question from Bradley Frolick. How can we use data analytics to improve accountability in the light of the New Nation Movement judgment, which opens the door for independent candidates to participate in national elections? You got that, Lawson, from Bradley Frolick. Third question. Frank Gonsenhauser, that sounds very German, I beg your pardon for the mispronunciation that I suspect I may have gone through there, Frank. Nobody seems to be addressing that no parliamentarians have a direct responsibility to voters. I think you're the one person who has touched on that the most there, Ms. Tembile. So may I please direct that question to you from Frank. Nobody seems to be addressing that the point that no parliamentarians have a direct responsibility to voters. And perhaps I might tie to that question, Stembile, which is a question that I actually had written down for you. Among the many things that the Moerane Commission of Inquiry does talk about, although it was answering a separate question as to taxi violence, in political killings in the KwaZulu-Natal, he points to the fact that it is such a low-hanging fruit to become a ward councillor in this country. You only need to have the pull factor within that given community and you have passed the muster of being a ward councillor and being in, if you like, local government space. So between what Frank has said and what I've just tied to, please respond to that. To you, Chantal, as a start, we should have the president directly elected so that the first citizen is not beholden by party dictates. I hope you get that. That is a question from Bonginkosi Mshengu. As a start, we should have the president directly elected so that the first citizen, president that is not beholden by party dictates. I'm interested in your thoughts there. And a final question to you, Vali. Just as the president's term is limited to 2 terms, is it not possible to limit all parliamentarians' terms to 2 terms? Please then, in the order of how the questions were phrased, would you respond? Albi, Lawson, Stembile, Chantal, and Vali. Albi?
Right. First of all, can I thank Vali Musa for resolving a lot of questions in my mind to getting the balance right. And I can't help thinking that if we'd had single constituencies, Vali Musa wouldn't have been elected to the first parliament because he didn't have the that kind of bacho style, and he wouldn't have been elected by the Indian community and the whites wouldn't have elected him. So there's a bit of a contradiction there, but he could have come in on the list system. And so I'm persuaded by his approach. And I think the question put to me is absolutely legitimate. If you have a right to stand for parliament, that right shouldn't be limited unduly by impediments in terms of registration. On the other hand, you have to have registration. You register, you take oaths of office, you conduct yourself in a certain way. There are penalties for misconduct. So you do need registration. In terms of the fees, if the fees are too high, that would be unconstitutional. And you can always go back to the Constitutional Court to say you can't have independents standing if they're not backed by big money. So that's an impediment to that. I do hope Vali Musa has a few seconds to say something about the campaign finance, whether or not it's directly on question. He's made such a huge contribution, and I think the listeners would enjoy getting at least a synopsis of the importance of the campaign financing thing.
I'll allow Vali to respond to that part when he responds to his question as to the terms of the president. I say nothing in relation to campaign financing and this small, big thing, CR17. Lawson, you want to respond?
Thanks, Ngeza, and thanks to all the panelists for their participation here. Look, the issue around data and analytics and accountability, accountability is fundamentally a political concept. It's a subjective issue. I don't think it can be narrowed down to, utilizing techniques such as data analytics to try and extract the kinds of accountability. It may well be a tool that we use in measuring performance of people in some way or the other, but I don't think we can rely on that solely as a mechanism for accountability. Ultimately, it's about does the representative serve the interests of the voter? Is the expectation of the voter from that representative met or not? That's I think the yardstick that the voter would use to determine whether or not someone has done a good job as a public representative. So data analytics, other forms of measuring performance are certainly useful, but ultimately that's the power that the individual needs to exercise in order to ensure that we do have accountability in our political system. Thanks, Ngeza.
Thank you so much, Lawson, for your response there. Stembile, you heard the question. You want to shoot?
Yes, thanks so much for that question. And just to agree to say that, yes, currently with the proportional representation system we have and the closed list proportional representation system, because there are different types of PR system that you can have, where voters can have more say in the compilation of the list, in the compiling of the list that of each political party. So a country like the Netherlands, for example, has an open list system, an open list PR system where there's 2 rounds of voting, so that voters can have a say in the list that their party puts forward. We have a closed list system, so political parties have complete discretion in deciding who goes onto that list and in deciding how those decisions are made. And so each individual MP is then incentivized to want to please the party bosses or the people that make up the lists or that compile the lists far more than pleasing the voters directly, because there is no link, there is no direct responsibility of an MP to the electorate. And that's certainly one of the things that our recommendations as the Ministerial Advisory Committee seek to remedy. I just want to say briefly, though, on the direct election of the president, that is something that we as the Ministerial Advisory Committee did look into in terms of some of the recommendations and submissions that we received. But the boundaries of our work as a committee was really in terms of the Constitutional Court judgment from last year and working within the Constitution itself. And our Constitution in Section 46 states that the president is elected by Parliament. The president is not elected. At the moment in our Constitution, we don't have the room to have direct presidential election, and that would require a far more substantial constitutional amendment than what has been stipulated in the Constitutional Court judgment from last year.
Well, Amendment 18 is not impossible. We have had 17 before. Chantal, your response to the question posed to you?
Let me just, did I get the question now correctly? Should the president be elected directly? Is that what you say?
As a start, should the president be elected directly so that the first citizen, the president, is not beholden to party dictates? In other words, how can we insulate the president from party political issues to purely being a state functionary?
Yes. Yes, I believe that if the people elect their own president, it will be much better. Directly, accountable to the people. In all of this, for me, it's about the people. It's not really about the leader or the independent even. or who's going to represent the people, but what the people want. And it's always been about the people, you know, the South Africa belongs to all, live in it and all of that, but it doesn't feel like that at the moment. It doesn't seem like that at the moment. It seems like it belongs to political parties, especially the leaders, all the decisions that are made. It's just not the people, it's not their voices. You hear, and you know, when you're closely working on the ground and you walk with the people, you understand, you hear the heartbeat of the people, you read all of these, you know, like I mentioned, not here, but I said that I think I wrote to you about the African Renaissance and all of these wonderful ideas and things on paper. But walking through life and democracy and walking through, you know, being involved in the struggle in apartheid and then being involved in this whole 27-year democracy, and then you begin to think that a political party and the rules and everything that is just part of it just don't work for the people of Africa. And for me, it must be directly what the people want, what the people say, and then just form something that will work for everybody. But inherently to say that you're African and then you cannot live as a person of the land, connected to the land. I mean, I read Mbeki that he acknowledged the land first, the hills, the mountains, the thunders, the citizens of the veld and all of that. And none of these things make sense when you say you're African, but then you have to adhere to foreign policies, that's not African. And I think that for me was so wrong in the beginning. We've become part of a system that just doesn't work for us. And as for the first citizens, we can't cope with it. We haven't been coping with that for the last 350 years. And the way things seems now, it will never work. So we need to get the people involved. And when people make the cross, even if they think they're independent, it has to be about the people always.
About the people always. And then always. That leads us to you then, Vali, and appropriately so. Just as the president's term is limited to 2 terms, is it not possible to limit all parliamentarian terms to 2 terms? I tied that question with this comment coming through, and it could only be a Mapete who says this, Pamela Mapete, a sister of mine. I would really love and appreciate an active monitoring and evaluation system of MPs and their functions in terms of constituency engagement, because at present we just see old people sleeping in the chamber and not really accountable to voters. So should there or is there merit in limiting the terms of an individual to serve in parliament?
Yeah, I'm tempted to just say one word about what Chantal has said. I think it's on the balance. You know, a democracy is not a perfect thing. It's a very messy system. Very, very messy, but necessarily so. Firstly, we must not be denigrating about the role of political parties. Our democracy cannot function without the institution of the political party. Political parties are absolutely essential to the functioning of our democracy. And we need to take steps to ensure that political parties don't go rogue. And how can we deal with that? And LB has mentioned something which I'll come back to in a moment. The second thing is that a directly elected president makes us more vulnerable than a president that is elected by parliament. And we can see that in the case of our last 2 presidents. Let's take the case of President Jacob Zuma. His own political party, the ANC, arrived at the view that his continued service as president of the country was detrimental to the nation and the republic. And they asked him to step down as president of the country. He refused to step down. And the ANC then prepared that in Parliament, where the ANC enjoys a majority, they were going to pass a vote of no confidence and remove him. Because he was appointed by Parliament, he could have been removed by Parliament. And the ANC already started taking steps to convene a parliamentary meeting to do this. And as that was progressing, President Zuma decided to step down. And I'm absolutely convinced that if Parliament didn't have the power to remove him, he would not have stepped down. I'm now not talking about an impeachment process, which is a different thing altogether. I'm talking about Parliament can vote in and vote out a president. And I think that proved to me that the check and balance and the safeguard that we have, it's much better than us directly electing a president, doing it through Parliament, because when things really go bad, it becomes possible to remove such a president. And an impeachment process like in the United States rarely ever works in any case. And it takes so long, by that time the president's term is over. But that's not what you asked me to go. You asked me to comment on the term of office. When we were drafting the Constitution and we put in there a 2-term limit for the president, it wasn't uncontroversial. It was a very controversial thing, because look at the IFP leader. He's been in power forever. Look at the DA now. You've got Helen Zille coming back to power for a very long time. And in the ANC, there was a fairly big body of opinion which said, why put a term limit? Because if we have a really good cadre, we should allow him or her to, and it was generally a him, rule for a very long time. But the majority in the ANC, of course, opposed that. And I get shudders even up to now to think we almost lost it. What would have happened if we didn't have the 2-term limit for the president? I haven't really applied my mind to term limits for members of Parliament. I only started thinking about it now, and on my feet, I would think it's probably something worth thinking about. Because if I think about myself, I served 2 terms in Parliament, and I voluntarily then decided I won't run for elections again. And then I went into doing other things, mainly working in the private sector, etc. And it made me realize how little I knew when I was a member of Parliament. And I think there's a good reason for people not to be professional members of Parliament. Be in the church, go to Parliament, go back to the church. Be in a big company or a small company or in a medical profession, go to Parliament, go back to your job. In that way, I think we could have members of Parliament who would be more in touch with reality. Somebody who's actually worked as a nurse for many years, goes to Parliament and knows I will have to go back to my job after my term is over. I think you would bring a different kind of reality. So there may be, I haven't thought about it enough to actually say this is what I think, but I think there's a reason to think about it. Finally, thank you, Albie, for mentioning the question about party finances. Our system depends on political parties. Even if we reform it, even if we have single-member constituencies and we have a lot of independence, everywhere in the world, political parties dominate parliaments. And our parliament is the ultimate expression of the sovereignty of our nation. But if those political parties that run parliament are not what we think they are, if they are controlled by a foreign government, especially a hostile foreign government, or if they are controlled by cigarette smugglers, as cigarette smugglers in the recent years have been very influential in our parliament, or other sorts of people that we don't know, then we as voters are voting for what we don't know. And it's for that reason that we need rules of who political parties can take money from or not. Firstly, they should not be able to take money from foreign governments, because no foreign government should control our most sovereign of entities, which is Parliament. Secondly, we as voters should know who funds the party that we support. Because if the party is supported by disreputable elements or elements we don't agree with, then we should know that, because he who pays the piper calls the tune. And that is a golden ancient rule which applies up to now. And therefore there should be full transparency as far as political parties are concerned. So Ngezo, you mentioned CR17. Let me not duck that issue, especially because I'm a big supporter of our current president. I don't believe that even within political parties, in the internal election processes of political parties, only those who can raise a lot of money should stand a good chance. And there should be a regulation of that, and there should be transparency of that. Of course, CR17 did nothing wrong because no law applied and they broke no law. But going forward in the future, I do think that you can't have a situation where wrong elements support a candidate in the EFF or the DA or the ANC who then gets elected with that kind of financial support rather than gets elected by the members of that party. So I think the full transparency will go all the way. The law is now in operation, and it's really to keep the integrity of our system. It's one more measure. You know, let me say in conclusion that South Africa is a wonderful country. We have a lot of compliance. If you take our banks can't easily go wrong because there are so many laws and compliance measures that require them to do the right thing. The companies that are registered on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange have to report on a whole range of matters. Everybody has to be compliant. The only entities in South Africa that had no compliance or governance requirements prior to the Funding Act are political parties, because the political parties in Parliament passed laws for everybody else, but nothing applied to them. Now we have that. It came into operation on the 1st of April, and I think it's going to change the political landscape of this country. Thank you very much, Songezo.
Thank you very much indeed, Vali. I think you have said your last point, so I'm not going to come back to you. And I believe because we opened with you, Albi, and we've given you enough time, I do believe because of the pressures of time, I'm not going to say more. Only my response to you, Vali, is when you mentioned banks and that they can't do much wrong, all I thought of was VBS. You don't have to say anything in relation to that. Final comment from you, literally 1 minute. Lawson, 1 minute. Chantel, 1 minute. Stembile. Lawson, 1 minute, you're on mute. I see Lawson is not around, so shall we move on straight to you then, Chantel? 1 minute to conclude. Say anything that is on your chest that you feel you've somehow left out that you think would be valuable for us to hear. Literally 1 minute and no more.
Yes, like I ended off earlier, it's all about the people. You know, it's always been about all the people, and you know, this racial dividends and making everything about race, it does start with I believe political parties as well and being fueled by it. But when people find each other in the common ground of where they come from, I know that we said earlier that it's not our democracy or was not built on ethnicity and all of those things. But you know, if you have that core value, if you know where you come from, you know where you're going to. And for me, that is the most important. We'll never forget that where you come from, being an African, being a mother, being a woman in this country, and find each other in that I think that ethnicity should play a role, and the core values that we have, and looking to each other as human beings. And then, you know, it would be just easy to run a country by finding one another.
Fantastic, much appreciated. Thank you for your shorts, Chantel. Final comment then from you, Stembile.
Thank you so much. I just want to say that I think that this process of electoral reform that we are in is one of the most important moments of our young democracy. And as I kept on saying in the Ministerial Advisory Committee, that actually the main show, the main place where all of this will be ventilated is in Parliament when the discussions begin on the amendment of the Electoral Act. And I want to encourage everybody who's watching to keep up with whatever the discussions are going to be in Parliament. Send through submissions to the committee that will be discussing it in Parliament, and really make your voice heard about the new electoral system that will be adopted, because it really is going to make a difference to our democracy going forward. So it's a great place to start of making your voice heard. Thanks.
Participants, Albie, thank you very much for your wisdom as always. We do appreciate your being present among us and offering a lot of accounts which Google doesn't have and will never have. Thank you so much, and it is so good to see you. Very much alive, kicking and doing well, Vali, doing the good work in private sector and empowering yourself with the kind of knowledge that our colleagues in Parliament do not have. Thank you so much as well to you, Lawson.
No, Songezo, no, I'm not in the private sector. I'm now a retired gentleman. and that's why I'm interfering in the politics of the country from that point of view.
Well, we all need something to do. We appreciate that all the same, buddy. Much appreciated for your comments and thoughts. Lawson, the same for you as well. But I suppose the reason why you had to go slightly off is you have some infernos to put out at Cricket South Africa if the social justice and nation building hearings are anything to go by. And we certainly do wish you all of the very best as the board chairperson of Cricket South Africa. Plenty of work to be done there. Princess Chantal Ravel, thank you very much for your thoughts and perspectives. And we certainly do hope that the outcomes ultimately of the new nation judgment will yield the kinds of reforms that can see the minority communities genuinely represented in the national dialogue in matters of importance in that regard. Stembi Lembeta, thank you so much, ma'am, coming through with beautiful political science and the science of the things that we are dealing with. And it was great to see that you are a participant there, offering perspectives, not just from a young person, but the evolutions of the discussions of elections are well represented in your being there. With that said, folks at home, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for your patience as well. We are woefully out of time, but at which point could really I have truncated this conversation given the gravity of the points that were put forward by our fellow participants. That's all I have to say now. Noreen, thank you so much. You are here to express the final word on this being the third roundtable, We the People, electoral reform. Can we build a better democracy? All I have to say is democracy is the worst form of government, except all the others. That's what Winston Churchill said. You might have perspectives, you might have views. I don't know. It's all yours. Noreen Wahome.
Thank you so much, Songezo. It's really a pleasure for us to have had another opportunity to host this really interesting discussion as we reflect on what it means to mark the 25th anniversary of our Constitution. I hope that we can take away from this conversation the rights of the people of South Africa and the representation that they deserve, especially at a local level. Lastly, let's remember that the elections are an instrument to get leaders to account to the people on mandates received, and more importantly, to be able to have a discussion on what has been shared tonight, especially the challenges. And we hope that you'll be able to lead those discussions in your communities. We also wish to express our gratitude to Songezo, all the speakers, and of course to the Constitution Hill, who are our partners. So thank you again. Bye.